So this is the Understanding Environmental and Climate Justice breakout session, and we have a wonderful panel here. We have Heather Toney, who is the Community Engagement VP for Environmental Defense Fund, and I love Mississippi. You have a great background as the first female and first African-American mayor of Greenville, and also worked with the EPA. And then we have Esther Dyson, and some of you who are involved in business and technology may know Esther, just a tremendous background as a commentator, as a kind of an expert in the tech industry, and also as an investor, now involved in health and wellness. And we've got Margot Brown, who is the VP for Justice and Equity for the Environmental Defense Fund, and has been involved with justice and equity issues in underserved communities for 20 years. So it's great to have you all here. You know, when we were organizing this event, we discussed what should we name it. And we talked about environmental justice, we talked about climate justice, and in fact, we kind of came to the conclusion that they're two different things. They overlap. So I wondered if one of you, and I think Heather, as I recall, we volunteered you to explain, to define and tell the difference between the two. So if you would, that would be great.
Sure, well, we'll just jump right in. Environmental justice really thinks about the policies and the laws that disproportionately impact people. And so you think about environmental justice as in toxic water, lands, and things that have effect on some populations that don't have an effect on others. Climate justice, I think the way that Amanda Leland described it perfectly earlier, is the most vulnerable people being protected first. So climate justice is more future forward thinking of who's in the paths of tornadoes, storms, hurricanes, vulnerable populations that are impacted, and then access to equitable solutions for those communities.
Yeah, great explanation. That's good. Now, Esther, you're very much focused on wellness or health. So how does that fit into this kind of dichotomy of these two issues?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. In a sense, I'm the straight man here, because this is not what I talk about normally, and so I'm learning on the job. Basically, Wellville is a 10-year nonprofit project focused on equitable health, and it turns out health is a result, and health is an asset. It's something you can either create or destroy, starting with maternal care, the environment you grow up in, sidewalks, lack of sidewalks, schools, and of course, you live near some kind of toxic power plant, all the things we're going to be discussing today. Yeah. So that's why I'm here.
Yeah, focus. Hey, since we have you talking, I wanted each of you to kind of introduce yourself briefly and what your role is in your company. So why don't you start? What is Wellville?
A 10-year nonprofit project, and it was funded by me because I couldn't find anyone else who would commit to even 5 years, which it was originally, and now 10. And it's not a nice white lady is coming to save you. There's this team of people, if you want to apply, and they will coach your own leaders. So we don't hand out fish, we don't teach people to fish. We help them build their own sustainable fishing schools. And it's like we're the coach, but when we leave, they've built something for themselves that they own. And Wellville's role in this, number one, is to help make that happen. And the communities want it to happen. We want to use it to publicize what they've done and get other people to say, wow, if those people in North Hartford or Muskegon or Clatsop County, Oregon, or Lake County, California, or Spartanburg, South Carolina could do it, so could we. So we want to model and inspire and change how people vote, which will then ultimately change our policies.
Great. Yeah, I know you've started with 5 communities, one of them in West Hartford, near my house.
North Hartford.
North Hartford. Oh, I'm sorry. West Hartford. That's a very different place,
yes.
Isn't it? Yeah, North Hartford. And I look forward to getting to know the people there. Heather, why don't you describe basically your role in the organization? Because I think Margot is going to kind of talk about the organization more deeply, but if you just say what your role is, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm the Vice President for Community Engagement at the Environmental Defense Fund, and we're looking at how we can practically apply those solutions, global solutions for climate change, in a way that we can scale in communities, and a way that they are empowered to follow and do those ideas in a very practical way.
Yeah, very good. And Margot, what's your role? And tell us about the organization. What is EDF doing about climate justice and environmental justice?
Thank you. Well, EDF is known for finding the solutions that work, especially around climate change. And one of the things that EDF has done in the past is develop solutions that were not always informed by the communities who were the first impacted and the last to be served by the climate crisis. And recently I was brought in, as was Heather, to begin to help the organization move to a new place. EDF moves at the speed of light, and environmental justice and climate communities move at the speed of trust. Those are two very different time continuums. And my job at the organization is to begin to integrate justice and equity into all of our programming. And I'm thrilled to say that EDF has taken 3 critical steps over the last, I'd say, year to really begin to position ourselves to think more holistically when we try to approach the climate crisis. So the first thing we've done is develop a set of vision and principles that sort of guide us on how we should behave in the environmental justice and the climate justice space. The next thing that they have done is develop an environmental justice strategic framework to really help the organization think about how to address justice and equity. And the final and most important thing that I think the organization has done to date is, as part of our strategic planning that we're undergoing right now, they are integrating justice and equity into the strategic planning initiatives. So environmental justice does not sit over here as a program, but environmental justice is integrated into all of our work, and climate justice is integrated into all of our work, so that we are really able to address this in a holistic fashion and eliminate those blind spots from the past.
Yeah, that's great. So if you would, what are the biggest challenges that you faced, your organization faces, and we as a species face when it comes to addressing these issues?
I quite personally think the biggest challenge we face, and I would say just from a US perspective right now in terms of climate justice or climate injustice, is voting rights. I see your face with that answer. And what a lot of people may or may not know, but people who identify as Latinx or Black tend to prioritize climate change when they're making decisions as to who they're going to vote for. Our last speaker talked about gerrymandering and the Voting Rights Act. And if these individuals' votes are suppressed, it is going to be much harder for us to be able to really address the climate crisis here in the United States.
It's interesting that you say this, because I think kind of the common sense quote response is, well, people who are, maybe disadvantaged in economically or are the subject to negative environmental forces, that they're just worried about getting through the day. But to say, the disadvantage, or in fact, our climate voters, is really a kind of, I would say, a shocking thing to say. So, I mean, where do you go with that, and how do you turn that fact into leverage that could change things?
Right. So just really quickly, how do you get through the day? How do you get through the day if you're living next to a plant where you're being poisoned your entire life? How do you get through the day if you're living in southern Louisiana and you're constantly packing your bags and running from a hurricane? So these are the people who are the most impacted by the environment and by climate change, and that's why it's a priority for them. So how do we begin to address that? One way that we're doing it at the Environmental Defense Fund is we've developed a Environmental Justice Community Capacity Center. It is a freestanding center that is independent of EDF. And the purpose of the center is to provide technical, organizational, and financial resources to frontline or environmental justice organizations. And to Esther's point, it's really about not giving someone a fish, but giving them the resources to be able to fish and to be able to advocate for themselves.
That's great. So Esther, talk about the challenges that you see communities facing, specifically in health related to the environment.
Yeah, so there's so many different problems. The ones we're focusing on, and to some extent, is short-term thinking, self-centered versus long-term thinking for the community or the country as a whole. And it's not you should think longer term. It's when you grow up with shortages of resources, you do have to manage through the day. You need to, doctors think, well, it's this drug or that drug. People with very little money think, well, it's this drug or the kid's shoes. And there's everything is a trade-off. You can't really budget. You need to pay what comes first so that you can live for another day. You can't get training for a new job because you're working too hard at your old job. And children grow up in this environment with feeling, they're insecure. They don't trust things. You talked about trust. It's so important because trust lets you think long-term because you have agency for the future. And just as people get addicted to drugs or sex or meta, excuse me, or gambling,
yeah.
Community organizations get addicted to short-term grants. We have this part-time coordinator. The science course for juniors in high school has ended. Now we need to find something else for it. Oh, there's a chess club for seniors. She can do that for a year. And again, they never have the time to build their own capacity to invest. Everything is spending. And so we try and ask them questions. We don't bribe them to do stuff. We don't give them money. We do help them to find money, but we help them figure out what is it they really want to do? How do they want to scale it? And they have amazing resources. They just need that little coaching to think longer term and build stuff. And I wish foundations, this is my big ask, don't make people compete for grants. Have bigger projects where community organizations need to collaborate and fund them effectively and don't waste all their money writing these grant proposals in your template and not in anybody else's template.
Got it. That's absolutely true. So let's talk about success stories. If each of you, and we're going to get to you in a moment, Heather, but if each of you could pick one success story that you've seen work in this area of environmental justice or climate justice, what have you seen work? How could that be scaled up?
There are a number of success stories that I have seen throughout my time in this movement. And I think the biggest success stories I have seen is really going back to the whole point around advocacy. And a lot of times we hear now, well, environmental justice groups and frontline groups should have a seat at the table. A seat at the table is the floor. What they need at the table are the utensils and the plate and the cup to engage in that meal.
Yeah.
And success is really going to come from when we're able to equitably distribute resources and power to those groups so that they are able to speak for themselves.
Okay. All right. So have you seen, is there a spot where this has been done successfully and you can point to it? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think recently, I'll give you an example with the Bezos Earth Fund. They have given dollars to a bunch of environmental justice leaders like Dr. Robert Bullard, Peggy Shepard, Dr. Beverly Wright. And these individuals have been in this fight forever. And now they have the opportunity to engage in a way that they never have because they have the resources to do so. And being able to give them the resources to really mobilize the work that they've been trying to do for decades, I think is going to shift the narrative around environmental and climate justice.
I think that's a great example. Esther?
I don't have anything that really qualifies in this context.
That's a big success story. Yeah, you're still early in the process, right?
Well,
yeah.
We've had successes, just not really on the environment. One thing I will say is, for example, in Muskegon Heights, one of our communities, there are a bunch of outsiders who say, we want to fix the speed bumps. And they finally listened to the community members who said, not really, unless you give us good sidewalks, because those speed bumps keep you from driving through our community too fast, and we're worried about our kids. So fix our sidewalks first, please. And that's starting to happen.
Yeah, well, that's a great example, very practical. Yes,
Can I
go-
share maybe?
please, absolutely.
So I immediately thought of Spartanburg, South Carolina, and the Regenesis Project, which started out with a very small EPA workforce development grant. And this is a small community in the African-American part of town that really had bad housing. And so from EPA's perspective, it was, we want to help to reduce the toxins from a brownfield that was close by, but the people in the community wanted housing fixed. And so through a workforce development grant, people were trained to put solar on housing. Well, that was leveraged into a HUD grant, which was also leveraged into a transportation grant. Now they have a $30 million project that has addressed all of those problems. Another is Charger Health that came out of California. 2 African-American women who figured out that with all of these EV stations, the time to fix them was like 6 to 12 hours. So if they could only just take their business and focus on fixing EV, since we're supposed to have so much EV throughout the country, then that was a good business model. They were able to take that model from California to Texas to Florida and are duplicating it as an entrepreneurial effort for small communities and minority women. So I think there are a lot of examples that are out there.
So we got to
Esther.
talk later, because I didn't see it that way. And yeah, great. I knew
No,
that.
that's
but I
very
didn't-
cool. Now, Heather, you're on a roll now, so I'm going to continue with you. So, you know, we're talking about programs done kind of like nonprofits at the local level. Let's rise up, or I don't know, that's probably a prejudicial thing to say about it, because it's another level. Let's talk about government policy, regulation, and legislation. What are the most critical things that national governments, state governments, local governments could do to really address environmental equity, you know, on the local level, environmental and climate equity on the national level?
So I do believe, as Margot said, it does start with voting. Yale did a study that showed that Black and brown people are more likely to vote for climate policy than anyone else in the nation. And if you think about it, it's practical and it makes sense, because minority people are more likely than others to be in contact with the elements due to the places in which we work. You have more Black and brown people that are in environmental spaces where they're coming in touch with toxins. So think of your janitors, your beauticians, your nail technicians, but also the people who are out in the agricultural industry, who are actually out there turning on the utilities. So it's not a surprise that that's the space where we need strong action at the federal level. The other issue is that if we do not have people who can actually have access to voting, we don't have the people in the seats to make the policy change. So it's a cycle that really we have to look at and address. The second thing is certainly there's a lot of funding that's coming out through the infrastructure bill, and I think Build Back Better is a wonderful, huge opportunity for us to see funding come to vulnerable populations. There's a part of this called Justice 40. I'm not sure if a lot of people have heard of it, but Justice 40 is an initiative from the Biden administration that is the all of government approach. It says that we should take 40% of any funding that's going to federal agencies, and the benefit of that should go to vulnerable communities and populations. It's how we ensure that the money is actually being invested into the communities that need to be protected first. Well, that Justice 40 initiative started as an executive order in January of 2021. By July, there's actual guidance, and hopefully in 2022, we'll see some stronger push as to what agencies will actually do so that communities on the ground know for a fact, at least they have 40% that's coming that they can begin to put to climate initiatives. The last thing I think is something having to, that some businesses may or may not like, but it is a conversation going around in the SEC, and that has to do with climate assessments. It has to do with publicly trading companies actually assessing what are the real-time climate issues that they need to be accountable for, both to their investors, to the business, but also to ensure the reliability of business for the next generations to come. That one's still sort of a bit tepid in terms of the receptivity and whether or not there's voluntary versus mandatory engagement, but I think we'll see a bit more interaction on that in the upcoming years.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting you mentioned business. You know, we've talked about community, nonprofit action, we've talked about government action. You know, when we think about business, you know, there's this, you know, there's this kind of been this era of virtual signaling, kind of greenwashing. I was at COP26 in Glasgow. I know you were there also. You know, it was the government people and the business lobbyists who were behind the gates, and it was the people who were outside the gates. And so I think there's a lot of skepticism about business these days, even with all the pronouncements. Well, what are you really doing? So I want to ask all three of you, what's business, what's their role specifically? And because there's a lot of stuff about carbon, what's business's role in environmental justice and climate justice?
Want me to start?
Yeah, you're still on it, Tanner, so go ahead.
I was right. You're right. I was right there at COP26 and tried to spend some time outside the gate, quite frankly, to make sure that I was listening and deeply understanding what were the concerns, and then what is the difference between what's inside and outside of those gates. And I think business has a responsibility to understand that if they fail to address the reality of climate justice, then there's a possibility they're not going to be relevant in terms of how innovation is developed, the engagement of the most vulnerable populations as a part of the idea process. And, you know, at COP, there was a lot of focus on the main stages, but the real action was in the pavilions. The real action was people having the conversations amongst one another about what the solutions are. So with EDF, we had the methane pavilion we were a part of, where we had an environmental justice panel that talked about methane and environmental justice communities. And there was real significant, powerful, actionable items from that. One of the panel members said, you know, we need data from that satellite that EDF is doing, because that data we layer on top of other disproportionate impacts in our communities. So where there are methane leaks, we're able to also look at where we have educational problems and disparities, health disparities, and that gives us the fuel to change the policy. And so it's really important that business understand that we have such a moment now to intersect these things and really be more efficient in how we come about solutions as opposed to being more divisive.
Esther, I want to talk to you about actually exactly this issue, but it's really about investing, because I know you're an investor in addition to being the other things you do. Is impact investing, is it really having an impact on these issues?
Some is and some isn't.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are greenwashers, there are people who genuinely care, there are people who used to genuinely care, and then they get rich and they start paying too much attention to their shareholders, not enough to their customers. So let me tell a very short story and explain how it's relevant. This is 10 or 15 years ago. I met the CEO of Rite Aid.
Okay.
And I don't know who's CEO now. This was a somewhat senior gentleman. And I asked him politely, this was before CVS stopped selling cigarettes. Have you ever considered not selling cigarettes because you're a healthcare outfit?
Yeah.
And he said, young lady, until you and your friends have the balls to make us stop, we won't, because we can't disarm unilaterally. And so the meta of this is business needs to understand this is happening. Their customers care. What they should do is they should get together and lobby for regulations, because they can't disarm unilaterally. But if they disarm and all think long-term, they'll all have a better future. I mean, that's one reason I actually like Walmart, despite its dubious reputation in some places, because they're not going to succeed unless this country is healthy and it has enough people who can buy their stuff and enough workers who can work in their stores. And that's actually true of all these companies if they start thinking long-term, and they need to collectively do that across their industries without dealing with antitrust issues, and have the government make them do what they really kind of want to do, but their investors and the short-term traders won't let them do.
Yeah. Well, you know, businesses can have a massive practical impacts on communities. This example isn't exactly climate justice, but in my city, New Haven, there were no supermarkets anywhere near the middle of town. But the city fathers persuaded Stop and Shop to come in. That is a massive change in the availability of fresh fruits and vegetables. Just huge impact on, potential impact on the communities there. And I think that's, you know, impact investing. Yes, we need that. You know, carbon credits, you know, all this kind of carbon neutrality from business, but also action in the communities, really put it there, you know, that kind of thing.
Think about your workers. They keep saying they're our greatest asset, and then
yeah, that's right. Yeah. Anyway, hey, so we've been talking now we're talking communities. Let's go global for a minute. And I think David mentioned it earlier when he was talking to Amanda about this topic. You know, the kind of justice globally. You know, the developed nations have had 200 years of various phases of industrial revolution to really screw up the environment and to screw up the climate. Now they're basically saying, oh, well, we'll have to clean up our act, and so do you, developing nations, you know. And so that is unjust. So do you see, any of you see, a pathway to kind of addressing that injustice? What's the responsibility of the developing nations vis-a-vis not just kind of taking care of their own mess, but helping developing nations deal with it?
I personally think the one thing that developed nations have to do is look at the downstream impacts of all of the decisions that we've made and how those downstream impacts have had a catastrophic, you know, effect on places like India, where they're dealing with massive flooding, and other places where people are being physically relocated. And this is going to continue to happen. And we really have to take a step back and look and see, how are we going to do this? Because one of the challenges, for example, is we're talking about like vehicle electrification, like, you know, but what does that mean in a place like Africa? Yeah. It actually means more extraction in a place like Africa, because they have all the resources that are required. So when we begin to think now about sort of the solutions to get us out of this climate change, we also have to think about the downstream impacts. We have not done that in the past, and it's going to be imperative for us to have a more holistic view on how we're going to get out of this crisis. And it cannot be at the detriment of other people.
Yeah. Very good point. Go ahead.
Just to piggyback, I think that we have to give countries the benefit of the doubt, in that we understand deeply what the concern is and respect that, listen to it, at the same time of being committed to learning from the lessons that we have messed up in the past and figuring out a path forward together. And we have a role to play in that. You know, there are companies that exist in the United States domestically, but also operate globally, that we can talk to. We can say that if this is an environmental justice violation in the United States, don't go to the coast of Senegal and Ghana and try to do the exact same thing, because it's a violation in those spaces as well. And the power places that organizations and businesses have to do and say that, we should, and we do. And I think that's the place where we can find commonality, we can find solutions that move forward, that do respect what those countries are both concerned about, but the opportunities that they want, that they've seen us afforded with in the past.
Yeah. That's interesting, because, you know, regulation isn't going to be the answer. It's almost like the moral compass of the global company, where they have to say, this is right here, it's right there. And I think that's a really good point. Now, we talked about before that you were at COP26. Lots of mixed reviews around this, and I have my own mixed review, which I'll withhold. But did anything that happened there give you hope?
Yes, it did. The fact that I can say I was a part of an organization, EDF, that hosted a space for White House environmental justice leaders to come and talk about things that we don't necessarily agree on from the EDF stage is progress. That gives me hope. It gives me hope because it says we're having a conversation that are oftentimes very hard conversations, but we're in a place where we're listening to one another and that we're figuring out where's the commonality and where can we move forward efficiently and then scale. We might not all agree on carbon capture and market-based solutions. Everybody might not agree on that, but that doesn't mean we stop talking. And we've been able to keep talking and finding those commonalities. I was really happy to see a lot of the conversation that was happening in those hallways. Now, there's a lot of work to do because next COP, there needs to be a space where there's a pavilion just where we're talking about environmental justice. Or Reverend Miriam Hammond, who is the head of sustainability for the city of Boston. Boston is now a climate-focused city with their new mayor. She and I were saying, we were talking together, we were sharing a panel, and it's like, there's no place for us to just sit down and say, this worked, this didn't work. What are the exchanges of best practices? And now we're having a conversation of how to make that happen at COP27. So yes, there was a lot that needs to be fixed, but I have hope that we actually left with the intent to come back and figure out what have we done right and what do we need to do moving forward.
It's interesting that you mentioned kind of bringing together people, sharing knowledge. There is an organization and a digital platform called Sustain Chain that was, I think, launched at the UN about a year ago, and it's been expanded. And that really is kind of a place to bring together businesses, nonprofits, communities to work on specific solutions and to make sure that all the voices are heard and all the expertise is put together. So Sustain Chain. Check it out.
Check it out.
That was good. I was on the outside of the gates at COP26, and I could say that I've been proudly a member of the counterculture since 1968, and still there, right? So it made me feel right at home. One observation: 500 lobbyists from the fossil fuels industry were inside the gates. I ran into a group of indigenous people outside the gates who couldn't get in. And I thought that's my negative review of COP26. But just if I can have the floor for just one more moment, I went around and made a film about the voices of youth, because youth voices are not heard. Exactly, right? And they have the future. So we asked young people around Glasgow, and of course it was mostly a bunch of Scottish people, bunch of white people, but we asked them, what is your dream of a more sustainable future? And what are you doing about it? And the beautiful answer was, people have a dream. There's something they want, and it's a much better world, and it's a much more equitable world. It's not just about climate. It's about people and justice in that way. And they're working on it. And I was just so inspired and pleased, because I want to turn the world over to them as quickly as possible. The people who answered those questions. You
were probably there the night of Extinction Rebellion's protests outside. I was there that night too. Spent time outside the gates that particular night because it was such a great youth movement. And one of the things that I heard was not only that powerful voice coming from youth of those dreams, but how it intersects into so many other issues that we're all concerned about. I'm a mother. I'm concerned about my African-American sons being stopped by the police, whether or not they have asthma, if they're around toxic chemicals. I'm concerned about cultural things, but listening to other young people who are intersecting those same issues around justice, equity, health, housing, criminal justice reform, and climate. to me, that was the whole encouraging thing of like why we hung out there in the cold at night, and realizing that they were doing it around more police than I saw, even in the United States. So it was very real.
But without guns.
But that's true, without guns, and very visible because they all had on yellow.
Yeah.
But I think it begs the question of, are we really talking people? You know, and are we listening? And if we are, how do we scale that? You know, it's what Margot and I are doing. It's what we love about Wellville. It's talking people. It's coming up with these practical solutions. And it's what Amanda said earlier. There's no reason we can't figure this out.
Yeah.
You know, our children deserve that.
Yeah. You know, I've been involved in a group called Pivot Projects for the past year and a half, and I'll put a plug in for my book, The Pivot, Addressing Global Problems Through Local Action. And one of the mentors there was a guy, an educator, and he had this mantra. It was listen to learn and then act. And that was about climate education, but it could be said about anything. You know, we really need to listen. I mean, we hear the cacophony of television, of the quote experts, you know, blabbing and having a strong point of view and fighting with each other, you know, these staged fights on TV shows. But listening is a skill that our society needs to pick up and we need to take seriously. And it's not just, it can't just be, oh, just some, you know, we say we're going to listen. It's got to be true listening. So the last question I wanted to ask all three of you is, you know, I think, I don't believe in ever having a conversation unless it's a call to action. We're not just talking to each other. We're not just exploring interesting ideas. We must have change. So what is your call to action? And I'll start with you, Margot. What's the call to action today to the people in this physical audience and in the virtual audience?
I'll go back to the question you asked me earlier. I think the call to action is to really address voting rights. We're having these conversations about Build Back Better because people showed up and voted. And if we do not have, if people do not have access to the ballot box, it is going to be impossible here in the United States and even how we show up globally to begin to truly address the climate crisis. So for me, it's everybody coming out and supporting voting rights.
That's good. Esther.
It sort of depends who you are,
Yeah.
but the fundamental ask for me is think long-term and help those around you, the kids, whatever, to think long-term. And that, again, that involves giving people a sense of security, a sense of agency, a sense that they matter. The fundamental asset we have here, even beyond a good or a bad climate and the environment, is the people in it. And in so many places, these people are being damaged before they reach middle school. You know, we talk about training AIs. We don't talk about training kids. And that doesn't mean regimenting them, but it means just like what you do to an AI, explain how the world works, tell them they're loved, give them enough security so that they can put things away for the next day, so that they don't, they need to start having a narrative that is not, oh, this happened to me, but, these things happen and this is what I did to surmount them, to take advantage of them, to learn from them. We're doing one of these technical studies giving kids a sleep monitor, and our goal is not to make them sleep better. Our goal is for them to understand their own bodies and the food system. They run on sugar, the food system runs on money.
Yeah.
But the thing we're measuring is their sense of agency. You know how to sleep better if you want to.
Yeah.
God bless you, we'll help you. But it's up to you. You have the capacity to do this. And it's helping to inculcate that mindset in the next generation, however you interact with them.
No, I think that's beautiful. I think about, you have to do these things incrementally. Gaining knowledge, gaining agency, gaining confidence. And confidence is always gained in pieces. And I think people who are beaten down or don't have power or don't even expect to have power, gaining confidence is a tremendous challenge. And I think you're right. do it a piece at a time. Start with the person and their own health, and then go into the community and things like that.
And just one thing about gaining confidence, you gain confidence through failing and learning and doing it better. It's not through always succeeding.
Yeah.
Then you don't know, you were just lucky.
Yeah, that's great. What's your call to action?
So I would ask anyone who has lobbying teams, is sort of tagging on to what Margot just said, around voting rights, to encourage them to look at that. Also to look deeply at state preemptive laws. Right now we have 21 states with renewable energy preemptive rules that will not allow local government to do some of the very things that we're talking about. And that's going to impact bottom lines for businesses. So I would encourage you to have your lobby teams look at that on a state level. And then next, just engage consistently. You can follow us at EDF online. You can find any of us and follow and see what we're doing, what our organizations are doing. Same thing with Wellville. Find out and engage with what's happening, both from people who are here doing this work, but also as a part of your long-term planning in business. You should have people who are on your advisory boards, on your board of directors. You have the ability to appoint community leaders to be a part of your strategic planning process. You should do that. That is something you can actively do today that will make a difference long-term. And to the extent that we can help you to do that, don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah. That's great. And I plan on reaching out to EDF and Wellville to see what I can do with you. I mean, I think there's just tremendous organizations, and it's so great to have you all here. The last thing I'd just say is we have just a couple of minutes left. Are there any questions in the audience? I know we've allowed only 1 minute for questions, which is a faux pas. But yes, right here.
Thank you. Thank you. What do you think how important do you think homeownership is to rebuilding or building stronger communities?
I can try to give you a quick answer. It is exceptionally important, but the policies have to be equitable. It is very difficult to tell people who, because of racist housing policies from the 50s and 60s, to go plant in their backyard that they do not own, and the ground in which we're asking them to plant in is toxic. So we have to get into some of those local and state policies that allow for home ownership, look at climate infrastructure and funding as a way to provide access and benefits to communities of color that have been represented in this way, and really build to that. It is a strong indicator for how I think a community can really rebuild sustainably. Also look out for blue lining and green lining, and we can talk about that offline.
Here, here.
Any other last questions? Because we are actually at 000, but I'm sure there's flexibility. Last question?
Just
Okay.
one other thing.
Yes, please.
COVID caused both devastation and huge disruption, but it also gives you permission to change. You need to apologize for things you did, but it gives you permission to just start over and do it right.
I think that's a beautiful sentiment. It's time to pivot, in my view. All right.
There's a book about that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.